My best advice for you is to not ever wear a backpack on the front of your body. I'm not saying that the city is inherently evil.
Chicago isn't known for its safety. It is charitably nicknamed by the locals as Chirac. When I went abroad, I told people that I'd spent a lot of time here, and they always asked me if I'd ever been shot. So just for reference, that is the international reputation of this city. Now, I've lived here for the better part of 5 years. Is it really as dangerous as people think it is? Well,
let me read you some stats here. 2021 saw a 25-year high of homicide rates according to the Chicago Tribune, which is the main news source in Chicago. Essentially, there's a 1 in 100 chance that a Chicago resident will be the victim of a violent crime at some point during their stay here. For a population of 2.7 million people, that's a lot. That's a lot of crime. However, somehow, according to Forbes magazine, Chicago doesn't even rank among the top 15 most dangerous cities in the United States. Some of the places that are more dangerous I've never even heard of before. I'm not even sure I could pronounce them. So what you're saying is Chicago is not necessarily the sketchy part, but more so the entire country of the United States of America. I mean, Chirac definitely has its moments, but... And I know what you're thinking, what about all the gun violence that I hear about in Chicago? And you're not wrong. However, the vast majority of that gun violence takes place among the same 3 blocks in the deep south side of Chicago. So unless you wander deep past the city, you are probably going to be okay. I say this with confidence. You are far less likely to experience gun-related crimes anywhere else in this city. It's not to say that it can't happen, but you know, like muggings are a very real thing here, and you do have to watch out for that. So in the time that I've lived here, I've experienced a polar vortex. I've experienced the race riots of the year 2020. I've experienced coronavirus. The day that Biden got elected, you might have thought that it was a Pride festival. Apparently, there is a serial killer running around Chicago currently at this moment. I thought those were extinct, but apparently we haven't learned enough from Ryan Murphy's Dahmer fiasco. Now, all that being said, I will say, the place I live, the school I went to, the main campus is in a pretty bougie area 15 minutes north of the city center. This is where I lived, where I worked, where I went to school. The overwhelming feature of this neighborhood is this university. It is an intensely suburban area, and surprisingly, there's not a whole lot of nightlife comparative to other Chicago neighborhoods. Now, despite all that, people still get pickpocketed here. People get mugged here sometimes. I mean, the reputation of the area is that people who live here are either stupid college students with too much money or multi-millionaire families, or both, you know, you never know what you're gonna get. I knew a girl who got her wallet stolen right outside the place that we worked. All that being said, like, none of this is meant to scare you. I just want you to be aware of the very real potential threat that this city poses. If you are alert, if you are prepared, if you're listening, you're probably going to be okay. In my 5 years here, I've only felt uncomfortable one time, and that was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was walking down Halsted in Lincoln Park. I saw this really beat up car. It was going the opposite direction towards me, and he, you know, opened his window, hollered something at me that I didn't understand, whatever, went on with my day. About half a minute later, I saw the same car pull right in front of me. He must have gone back, turned around, come forward, and he parked like right in front of me along the sidewalk where I was walking. And he started to get out of the car, and he made direct eye contact with me, and I turned around and I ran. And it was scary. It was scary. I didn't have, you know, any pepper spray on me. Like, 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, you don't really expect to be followed. I don't know. That was the scariest thing I'd ever encountered. I have friends who have had bad experiences with the L or the elevated metro or just the Chicago public transportation, whatever you want to call it. Because when you think about it, you get onto a train, that is an enclosed space. People smoke there, people beg there, people drink, do other things, but you know, sometimes it can get violent. Other than that one experience, I have not really experienced any sort of violent crime take place in Chicago. Situations have a habit of finding you. Now, there are steps you can take to eliminate that probability as much as possible, and I attempt to do that, and I think most people do. And if you're interested in coming to our stunning city, I definitely encourage that you look into those, you know, such as carrying pepper spray, knowing your surroundings, knowing where you're going. Just be aware, that's all I'm saying. I go downtown a lot in the warmer months, and I will say if you're thinking about traveling here, these are the areas where you're probably going to get pickpocketed. I mean, if you go to the Bean, if you go to the Riverwalk, you know, the touristy destinations, people are going to assume you're a tourist and you're not from here. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, sometimes tourists can be the target of pickpockets and muggings and things of that sort. My best advice for you is to not ever wear a backpack on the front of your body. You might think this is safer, and I guess it is, but what that does is signals to people who are kind of, you know, searching around for someone to yoink. That shows them that you are not from here, you don't trust it, and you don't really know what you're doing. So that could make you a target, essentially. My recommendation is for you to keep everything, like your phone, your wallet, your keys, in your front pockets, or a secure purse that you can wear over your front, or that you are very confident nobody can, you know. I will tell you, I have stupidly walked across the city with my backpack hanging open and my laptop entirely visible from the outside, and nobody told me it was safe. Like, I'm not saying that the city is inherently evil. It's incredible, and I would love for you to join me here, but don't be stupid. Don't be stupid like me. I will say, however, though, as far as personal experiences go, like on the train, I had a friend who, it was his like third day in the city. He was a college student like me, and he got on the train and he was on his phone, and some guy was, I don't know what this guy was doing, but this guy he was like in distress or something, and he looked at my friend and he's like, "Oh, my daughter's sick, I need to use your phone, please let me call her, I need to know she's okay, I'll give it right back, like please, I just need it for a second." And my friend was obviously like, no. But this guy was incessant. He was like, "I swear to God, man, like, it's like, I'll give you your phone back, I'll give you money, whatever you need, like, blah, 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 I just need to call her." And so my friend's like, "Okay, whatever, let me just get this guy off my back." He hands him his phone. The guy, his whole demeanor changes. He says, "This is mine now." And he got off the train and left with my friend's phone. That's fun. Don't give your stuff to people on the train. That's all I have to say about that. Another thing I'd like to talk about is that there are a lot of unhoused people, especially on the L, especially on the red line. A lot of the other lines, you know, stop for the night at whatever time. It's different for each of them. The red line doesn't. And that means that a lot of people can safely sleep there. And they do. I want to make you aware of that, because for the most part, it's peaceful. It's just people sleeping. It's the best that they have that night. But occasionally it can get kind of spooky on the red line, especially as a young woman, especially going home at night. Like, that's already a scary situation. You don't want any other unforeseen factors coming at you, right? And it's kind of nerve-wracking when somebody who doesn't look like they are fully lucid starts yelling at you from 4 feet away, and you two are the only people in this enclosed environment. That stuff happens. You have to know what to do in that situation. You have to know what your limits are, where you're comfortable. I say if you're nervous about it, definitely get onto a more crowded train. And again, none of this is meant to scare you. These are just the realities of living in a major city. Frankly, a lot of my issues with Chicago as a woman were not with the city itself and the repercussions of living in a major city, but living in a college environment, right? You would not believe the amount of SA, Title IX, and unfortunately that's not something that really changes, you know, between school across the country. There's a huge reputation for SA in colleges. So as a woman in the city, I will say sometimes I will get kind of leered at or looks that make me a little uncomfortable, especially if I'm dressed nicely. And the one time I ever got catcalled, I was walking with my dad and it was winter and I was wearing a very long red coat. So I don't know what that guy really saw in me, but it wasn't anything worth opening his fat mouth about and yelling, you know? Like, there was no reason for that. I will say though, like, having lived in suburban Midwest, I used to get hollered at way more often as like a 14, 15, 16-year-old walking down the street in jeans and a t-shirt than I ever did here in this city. So another thing I want to talk about is the race riots of 2020. Famously in Chicago, there was a lot more destruction, a lot more damage than a lot of other places. I mean, most cities had their own thing. But Chicago, there was so much looting, people in the streets, people getting pushed around, police coming and shooting their little bullets at people and their tear gas and all this other stuff. And I'm not trying to get political here, but I will say, as somebody living in Chicago during that moment, you know, again, this COVID was happening, things were already extremely uncertain. That was nerve-wracking. I don't live very close to where all that stuff happened. I am also, you know, have to recognize my privilege here. But at the same time, literally every single member of my family was calling me up, being like, oh, you should move back home. You should come visit us in Florida. Like, I'm like, no, I'm actually okay. Like, I'm very far from all of the action. We're fine. Everyone I know is fine. Personally, I'm unaffected. And I'm very lucky to have been. I also want to say about all that stuff is that, like, in terms of civilian violence, there wasn't a lot. Like, there was property damage, but it wasn't like fights between two people were erupting in the street. It was mostly like as soon as the police would come to the riots and start shooting their gas, start shooting their bullets, that's when the violence really started. And that was really scary. Like, as a citizen of Chicago, that was really scary to see, because it's like, windows can be replaced, but people can't be.
So it occurred to me that I totally forgot to talk to you about my experience with the coronavirus in Chicago. As you can imagine, it was an experience, to be honest. Especially comparative to where I grew up in the Midwest, where the virus existed for about a month and then it didn't. It was one of those places, small town, you know how it is. But being in a major city in the middle of a global pandemic is definitely an experience that I would not choose for myself again. Hopefully no more pandemics, obviously. Suddenly everyone is afraid of the public transit. Nobody wanted to get on the trains, on the buses, touch anything that anyone else had touched, be in confined environments with other sick people. But I will say the general politics of the city align with health code suggestions, I'd say. So for the most part, people were extremely respectful, but for a while there, it definitely felt like a ghost town. There were, if I remember correctly, there were times of day when we were urged not to leave the house, such as noontime, lunchtime, when a lot of people were going to be out. Restaurants were closed, stores were closed. It was a really interesting experience. And the place where I lived at the time, it was kind of a food desert. We had a very limited array of options in the close proximity. So navigating that was interesting. But at the time I lived with my best friend and I had 2 other roommates as well. So I didn't feel lonely at any point. In fact, there were moments where I was like, yep, need my own space. I mean, when you're stuck in a confined space for the most part with the same people, even if you love them to death, you know, sometimes it gets to be a lot. It's just how it is. It's human nature. But I will say, you know, after the first wave of hysteria had passed, I mean, like, if you exclude the situation, if you exclude the number of fatalities of sicknesses, which, you know, stupid thing to say. Outside that part of the pandemic, the being confined to one space, I would say that was not as hard as it could have been in other areas of the world. Again, major city, you have access to most anything. It just took either an Uber or a train ride or a walk if that's what you preferred, and we walked a lot. I will say, as a funny story, the roommate that I was living with at the time, this was right before spring break of my second year of college. I was actually fit to travel with her to Texas to go on a big hiking trip with her family, and then they announced that it had reached a pandemic status and that flights would be shut down and all this stuff would be shut down. Obviously the trip was canceled, whatever. But my parents urged me to come home. It occurred to me very quickly that 3 people of our 4-person apartment were vacating the city, essentially, leaving my best friend by herself in a pandemic. And this friend, she was, God love her, she was probably the most cautious person I've ever met. She refused public transportation for probably a year. She double masked it, she gloved it, she nonstop hand sanitized it. She was determined not to get this virus. And that made things very hard for her. It gave her a lot of anxiety, and now she was alone. So we knew that she was going to be left alone, and I had an inkling of an idea that I would be spending my spring break home with my parents, but that it would extend a little past spring break, knowing my family. They would want to keep me home for as long as they felt I needed to be home. I didn't know how long that would be. It ended up being 2 months. So basically what happened was we got my friend a hamster to keep her company. And when I tell you, this hamster ate better than all of us college students. There were salads, she made him pancakes. Like, this hamster was her best friend for the pandemic. It was so funny. We got updates about the hamster. He was like the apartment mascot. And I'd like to say that that's the reason she kept her sanity. Yeah.
All in all, I'd say the drawbacks of living in a major US city did not distract me from getting my degree, did not distract me from living my life, from growing as a person, from making friends. Now, I don't know what it's like to live here as a person of color, obviously. I'm not a person of color. I will say that this is one of the most liberal, multicultural cities I have ever had the pleasure of being a part of. Any nationality, any race that you identify as or even don't, you can find community centers, museums dedicated to it. I hate it when people call America the melting pot, because that assumes that wherever you come from, you will essentially be melted down into one amorphous blob that is similar to everyone else. And I hope to God that isn't the case, because if that were the case, we wouldn't have all the incredible cuisine, all the incredible art, the literature that we do have. So I say do your research, be willing to learn about the areas that you want to explore. Be as safe as you possibly can. Try to avoid these situations, but also understand that it's not your fault. Sometimes they just find you, wrong place, wrong time, you know the drill. But be as prepared as you possibly can. I'd say if I end up in the US, if I am condemned to the United States, if I don't move abroad to settle, I would probably stay here in Chicago. I think it's beautiful, and I think it's so worth, like, the benefits vastly outweigh the drawbacks. And that's coming from a very short, weak woman. So I don't know, man. I just think it's such a stunning city. Well, folks, this has been so much fun. I hope I could change your viewpoint on this beautiful city. You have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend, and I hope you get to listen to that really good song that you love so much. Love you, bye!
We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.